Alright, after completing the ship platform and keel, let's move on to the frames. You can choose to start with straight frames or cant frames. We'll start with the straight frames here. If you prefer to start with cant frames, you can skip ahead. However, I will briefly explain the basic process of making frames in the straight frames section, so my recommendation is to take a look at this part first. First of all, before making the frames, you need to prepare these drawings. You need to have the drawings of these frames prepared. In my case, I will use the frame number 7 as for demonstration. First, we need to gather all the parts of this frame. All the parts of the frame are on these sheets, identified with numbers starting with B. There are a total of 8 sheets, from B1 to B8. You can find the frame parts on these sheets. Each frame has a unique identifier, so gather the parts with the same identifier. For example, for this sheet, since I am demonstrating the 7th frame, I have taken all the parts with 07. Take all 07 parts as the identifier from these 8 sheets. The reason for spreading them across 8 sheets is that these sheets has different thickness, so it's necessary to spread them across different sheets. As the frames have a thickness gradient, and you will see this gradient later on. Next, let's get to know the A side and B side. Oh right, after gathering these parts, they'll be placed here. I've already done this in advance. Now, the parts are approximately like this. For some frames, they may have more parts. For instance, in the front frames, there might be an additional one on top. On the other hand, for frames under the gun ports, like this one, there might be fewer parts. However, regardless, the key is to gather the parts with the same number. Once you've gathered them, you can place them here for comparison and check if you have all the parts. It's roughly like this, put them all on, check, and if you find that the quantity matches, then there are no issues. How to check specifically is to roughly inspect it, align the sanding lines, and so on. For example, this one, it's quite obvious here, it doesn't align because you also need to consider the contour, right? Even though it matches the groove, it doesn't align with the contour. Meanwhile, this one aligns with the contour. So, this is for one side. Later on, I'll explain how to distinguish between different sides and how to handle it during the assembly. And, for example, like this, when assembled, no issues, then good, this is one side. Now, the one I've assembled is the A side, and the frames are all divided into the A side and B side. You can see the vertical diagram here. And this is the A side. I've labeled the one with A, which is the A side, representing the rear one. The one labeled with B is the B side, representing the front one. For the A side, there is a connector at the bottom, and any part with this connector is for the A side, with this complete connector. As for the B side, the connectors at the bottom look like this, with these two parts connecting, indicating the B side. I realized that I missed one part here, but it's not crucial. If you notice such omissions, just go find them, it's okay. Alright, I found the missing part here. Once we've found it, we can start the assembly. Before assembling, we must first do some sanding. Sanding is needed on these surfaces, the mating surfaces. Because these mating surfaces may have a slight incline, and if not sanded, the adhesive strength may not be sufficient. So, it's essential to remove any carbon black by sanding. First, sand this surface, the bottom surface, which is the largest mating surface. After sanding this surface and ensuring there are no inclines, we move on to sanding this surface, and also these two surfaces. After sanding, you can ignore the inside surface. Even if it has a slight incline, it doesn't matter because we'll address that later. This is roughly how it should be. After sanding each mating surface, we can move on to the next step. Alright, so now the carbon black has been sanded on the mating surfaces. When sanding, pay attention to separating the A side and B side so that there's no need for additional sorting later. This will save some time. Next, we'll choose one side for assembling, and you can choose either side. I've chosen the A side here. Remember, the A side has the complete connection piece at the bottom. It has this small connecting surface. Let's place all the parts. We can see there are no issues with the parts. Now, let's observe the thickness variation of the frames. We can see that the A side has a thickness variation. The bottom part is thicker, being the thickest. The part above it is 0.5 mm thinner, and it protrudes towards the bow. The topmost part is another 0.5 mm thinner and protrudes towards the stern. At this point, the instructions mention using a spacer underneath, but you can actually skip using a spacer and take a shortcut. I'll explain this shortcut directly. However, if you prefer to follow the instructions precisely, you can use the spacer method. Now, the shortcut is like this: when you decide to skip using a spacer, you must think about the relationship with the sanding lines. This is crucial, otherwise, taking shortcuts might lead to issues. First, let me explain the meaning of sanding lines. I'll use another frame as a demonstration. Alright, let's use this frame for a demonstration. It's the 5th frame. I've already assembled this frame, but I haven't done the sanding yet, which is perfect for explaining the meaning of sanding lines. Firstly, let's look at one side. This side faces towards the bow and has an outer sanding line. Why an outer sanding line? Because it faces towards the bow, and the 5th frame is relatively towards the front. So, we can imagine the shape of the ship, right? The bow is tapered inward. Therefore, the outer side has a sanding line to create that indentation. So, sanding off this part of the sanding line will achieve this. And similarly, on the inside, there's also an indentation towards the bow. Since the front is pointed, the middle is rounded, it also has this indentation. So, inside, there is a sanding line here, and you need to sand this part off, sand up to this line. After sanding, it will look like this. This is the 3rd frame I did earlier. So, you sand from this sanding line all the way to this line, but be careful not to oversand this area. The purpose of sanding lines is not to flatten the area completely. If that were the case, there would be no point in having sanding lines, and we could just laser cut it. The purpose of sanding lines is to create a bevel. To bevel it, including this part, we bevel it from this sanding line all the way to this edge, and that's correct. Sometimes, it's okay to leave a bit of carbon black. You can see here I've left a tiny bit, just don't oversand it. If you completely remove it, you might oversand, especially if you're not very skilled yet. Inside, I've done a more detailed treatment. Actually, outside, you can leave a little, as you'll do an overall sanding later. Inside also requires an overall sanding, but it's not as easy to sand the inside. This is roughly what sanding lines mean. Alright, after discussing sanding lines, let's return to this frame. This frame is for the A side, right? So, typically, for the A side frame, you would need to use 2 spacers here and here, following the instructions. Because the bottom piece is the thickest, if you glue from bottom to top, you need a spacer under these 2 pieces. Okay, here's the shortcut. You can first glue this piece to this piece, and then glue the entire assembly to this one. In other words, glue these 2 pieces upside down. What does this mean? Normally, when you glue it, it looks like this. You need to observe the relationship, and if you glue it normally, the relationship looks like this. The 0.5 mm difference is on this side, on the side towards the stern. However, this contradicts the drawing. If you stick it normally, the difference doesn't match the 0.5 mm indicated on the drawing. The 0.5 mm difference should be on this side according to the drawing. Let's check the drawing. The 0.5 mm difference should be on this side. So, we need to find a way to make it like this. How can we achieve this? We glue it upside down, like this. The 0.5 mm difference is right here, right? It's right here. This spot will have the 0.5 mm difference, here, this 0.5 mm. So, we can stick both of them like this, both with the upside down approach. After upside down gluing, let me put these 2 pieces aside. After gluing them upside down, let's imagine we already have these 2 pieces. Now, let's look at the relationship between the bottom connector and these two pieces. The relationship between the bottom connector and these two pieces is that towards the stern, it should be 0.5 mm less, right? Towards the stern, it should be 0.5 mm less. So, we should stick it like this. It should be stuck normally. And if we stick it like this, imagine these two pieces are already here. This way, we achieve a 0.5 mm higher level here compared to this area. Then, on the back, compared to the upper part, it's 0.5 mm higher. When doing this, you need to think a bit more, think about the relationships. Next, I'll glue it together and explain further. Okay, so for the A side, I've already completed the assembly, and you can see the thickness variation. Looking here, the bottom piece, firstly, remember that the A side faces towards the stern. You can see here that the bottom has a 0.5 mm indentation. It's similar to this. There is a 0.5 mm indentation here. On this side, you can see there is a 0.5 mm indentation towards the bow, similar to this. Towards the bow, there is a 0.5 mm indentation, and that's how this frame looks. At the same time, I've also made the B side. The form is the same, let me go through it. Firstly, for the B side, the direction with sanding lines is towards the bow. This direction, with sanding lines, is towards the bow. Here, it's towards the stern, and this area towards the stern should be indented by 0.5 mm. This area towards the stern is indented by 0.5 mm. Maybe it's not very clear to see this area because this raised part needs to be cut off, and I'll demonstrate that later. After cutting off and sanding, it looks like this. For instance, here, I've already finished the operation, and this area needs to be cut off and sanded. Although the joint style may not perfectly replicate the actual ship, we made some simplifications and compromises at this small scale to ensure strength is a priority. However, sanding it off will make it look more authentic. So, later, I'll explain this to you. Now, towards the stern, it's indented by 0.5 mm, and towards the bow, here, it's also indented by 0.5 mm. So, this is the style of this frame. After gluing, if you use wood glue, perhaps you don't need this step. But if you use instant glue, then after gluing, remember to apply some liquid glue to penetrate. For wood glue, if you're not very confident, you can also apply some liquid glue to ensure the strength of the joint. Although we'll have other methods later to ensure the overall strength of the frame, having an extra security is always good. Now, let's proceed to handle this area here. This side has already been dealt with, this is the A side, and I've already worked on it. Next, let's address the B side. Essentially, it involves making a slight incision here. Take your knife and make a small incision. After making the cut, trim this area, being careful not to trim too much, trimming approximately like this is sufficient. Next, proceed with sanding. Okay, in this way, this area is completed, it looks like this. However, this is just a rough sanding. Later, including these areas with some black residue, you can perform a finer sanding. I won't demonstrate the fine sanding part here. This applies to all areas like this. Any raised areas can be incised, trimmed, and uneven areas sanded. Be careful not to over-trim. Following these steps, these two individual frames are completed. Now, let me talk about the assembly part. Alright, at the moment, both of these frames have been prepared, these two from the pair are done. Before starting the assembly, pay attention to one point, this groove here. This groove must be smoothed out to ensure it can fit onto the keel. If it doesn't fit, you may need to further smooth it. Use a small file to make slight adjustments, to ensure it fits onto the keel because the heights of these two grooves are different. For the shallower groove, you can make adjustments later, but for the deeper groove, if you don't smooth it now, it might be challenging to adjust later. Once it fits onto the keel, you can see there is a small step here. Make sure to smooth it out beforehand. Next, let's talk about the gluing process. Gluing looks like this. It is essential to ensure that the surfaces are correct. You must ensure that the sanding lines on both sides, if present, facing outward. When gluing, you must also compare with the drawing, making sure to refer back to the drawing to understand the orientation. For example, the frame with this is the A side, and with this is the B side, right? Confirms A and B side. Now, looking at the B side, the raised part should face the stern, towards the A side. On the A side, the raised part under this connection should also face the stern. When assembled, it should look like this, aligning accordingly. After aligning, apply some glue in the middle. Here, it is recommended to use wood glue because it provides sufficient strength. If you use instant glue and are not careful, there might be issues like opening gaps later on. So, for safety, it's crucial to use wood glue. So, first, glue up the bottom part, then proceed to the next step. Okay, now the bottom part is already glued and clamped. Next, we'll place the middle filler. For the middle filler, when you do it, you should use these small pieces on this sheet. They are intended for filling, and there should be enough of them. However, when I did it, I used this instead for various reasons. I made it a bit finer. Although it might slightly compromise the overall strength, it tends to be more faithful to the actual ship. If you want to do it this way, you can simply sand these pieces to make them narrower. It won't affect much. Now, how to glue this filler. When gluing, pick it up, apply glue first. After applying the glue, we choose a place to glue it. I glued it here because placing it here allows the planking to cover this point. I'm making this model with an open hull at the bottom, so it is essential for me to ensure that the hull can cover this point, otherwise, the bottom may not look good. However, you are free to place it any way you like, such as placing it at this point to ensure strength. That's also valid. Additionally, if you want to add another one, you can find a 0.5 mm corner material and place it here. The place with 0.5 mm gap, it's entirely up to personal preference. If you are confident, you can even skip adding this piece, but I don't recommend it. It's challenging to ensure that your frames are perfectly vertical. I recommend at least adding one. Usually, you put the second one slightly higher, and as for the specific position, just place it as you see fit. When placing it, pay attention to the top part. The top surfaces of these two must align. If they are not aligned, it may cause various issues during sanding. These top surfaces here must be aligned. Next, you can apply some more liquid glue to these small filler blocks. Then, remove the clamps and we can proceed to sanding. Alright, so in this way, the frame has been sanded. For this frame, you don't need to sand it too finely because, after all, there will be an overall sanding later. So even if you sand it very finely now, it won't make much difference. However, on both sides, if you want, you can sand this side and this side a bit finer. But I plan to do overall sanding later, so I won't do it now. But of course, you can sand each frame a bit beforehand, it's also fine. This side is the A side, and this side is the B side. The A side has a slant like this, and the B side has a slant like this, as you can see, with a noticeable angle. With this, a normal straight frame is already finished. Now, let me explain the straight frames with top variations. Okay, let me take this frame as an example. I haven't sanded this frame yet, but you can roughly see the situation of the top variation. The top variation is here, on the top. Here, we have given two options. One is a thicker piece, and the other is a thinner piece. When you remove all the pieces with the same number, you will know. In some sets, like this one, the 02 set, here, there is a top variation, indicating a change at the top. In the case of frames like this, for the uppermost section, there will be 4 frames, which are 2 pairs. one pair is thick and the other pair is thin. There are two different ways to make these frames. One method is a shortcut approach, where you directly use the thin one and adhere it without the inclined or curved sections like in my example. This is a more straightforward form, but it's suitable if you don't intend to showcase the upper part of the frames. If you plan to attach the planking above, where the frames won't be visible, the specific details here are not critical. So make it as illustrated, align it with a 0.5 mm offset. However, if you have higher standards, or need to match a specific context, as in my case, where I'm creating an open hull model with no upper planking on one side, you should use the thicker one. Sand both sides, reduce the thickness by 0.5 mm on top, and you'll achieve a result similar to what I have now. And then sand the carbon black. Alright, so we've completed the section on straight frames. In the next video, I'll walk you through the building of the cant frames at the bow and stern, and how to attach them to the keel. See you in the next video.